The first alien probe to reach Earth's exile system sent back a single transmission before its power core failed. Impossible. They're still alive. Commander Silas Holt stood on the observation deck of the UEF Resolute, watching the patrol ships drift through what the Galactic Covenant called the Void Scar, a region of space so hostile that even quantum drives destabilized. 300 years ago, humanity had been judged too aggressive, too unpredictable for civilized space. The Covenant had sealed the Sol system behind a dimensional barrier and left Earth to die in isolation. They hadn't counted on what desperation could build. "Commander, we've got a signature breach at marker 77 Alpha," Lieutenant Faye Cross reported from Tactical. "It's big. Covenant configuration." Silas turned from the viewport. "How big?" "Dreadnought class. The dimensional wall is fluctuating. They're forcing their way through." Silas felt the familiar weight settle in his chest, the same sensation he'd had before every engagement in the border wars, before humanity had learned it was alone. "Battle stations. Get me a clean read on that ship the moment it's through." The Resolute's crew moved with practiced efficiency. 3 centuries of exile hadn't softened humanity, it had refined them. Every resource had become precious. Every threat had taught a lesson written in survival. The dimensional barrier split like torn fabric, and the Covenant ship emerged. Silas recognized the configuration immediately. Velthari design, all sweeping curves and silver-gray alloy that could redistribute kinetic energy across its hull. The vessel was massive, easily 3 times the Resolute's displacement. Its weapons ports were closed, but Silas had fought the Velthari before the exile. He knew what those ships could do. "They're hailing us," Faycross said. "Put them through." The holographic display flickered to life. The Velthari commander stood with all 4 arms clasped in what humans had learned was a gesture of formal authority. Her skin held the pale luminescence of someone who'd spent their life in climate-controlled environments. Her name appeared in translation: High Commander Velxira of the Sovereign Wrath. "Primitive vessel," Velxira said, her voice carrying the same musical inflection all Velthari used when addressing lesser species. "You will stand down and prepare for inspection. By order of the Galactic Covenant, this system remains under quarantine. Your presence here violates—" "No," Silas interrupted. Velxira's 4 arms tensed. In 300 years of Covenant authority, apparently no one had said that word to her. "You do not comprehend the situation. We have detected unauthorized dimensional emissions from this system. You will submit to—" "High Commander, I comprehend the situation perfectly. 3 centuries ago, your Covenant exiled us to die. We didn't. Now you're concerned we might have learned something you don't control." Silas leaned forward slightly. "Here's what's going to happen. You'll turn your ship around, go back through that barrier, and report that humanity is doing just fine on our own." Velxira's secondary arms moved to what humans had designated a threat posture. "You dare issue demands? 1 Covenant dreadnought carries enough firepower to sterilize your primitive outposts. We gave your species a chance to survive in isolation. That mercy can be rescinded." Silas smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Lieutenant Cross, show the High Commander our hospitality." The void around the Sovereign Wrath suddenly illuminated. Hundreds of objects that had been drifting in perfect mimicry of debris locked targeting solutions on the Velthari ship. They weren't ships. Humanity had learned that conventional vessels were too resource-intensive for a quarantine system. These were platforms, automated, networked, and each one carrying enough compressed antimatter to crack a moon. "What?" Velxira's composure fractured for the first time. "Those signatures, that technology is forbidden." "To Covenant species," Silas agreed. "We're not Covenant anymore. You made sure of that." The Velthari commander's tertiary arms began moving through what the translation software indicated was a sequence of threat assessment gestures. "This is a violation of galactic law. The use of cascading antimatter weaponry was banned after the Korun Purge, yes. We know the history. We also know that galactic law only applies to species the Covenant considers civilized." Silas's voice hardened. "You declared us exiled. That means your laws died at the dimensional barrier." Velxira straightened, all 4 arms now rigid at her sides. "You would trigger a war you cannot win." "High Commander, we've been at war for 300 years, against vacuum, against radiation storms that would cook your crew through their shields, against resource scarcity that would have collapsed any Covenant colony in a decade." Silas gestured to the viewport, to the network of stations and platforms that had turned Earth's exile into something else entirely. "We didn't just survive, we evolved, and now you're in our territory." For 17 seconds, Velxira said nothing. Silas had counted. He'd learned that Velthari decision-making followed precise temporal patterns, and 17 seconds meant she was genuinely uncertain. That uncertainty was more dangerous than aggression. Stand down your weapons, Velxira finally said. We will negotiate terms. No, Silas cut the transmission. Faye Cross turned from her station, eyes wide. Sir, they're charging weapons. Expected. Execute Hollow Crown protocol. The Resolute's engines went cold. Life support dropped to minimum. Every system that generated a detectable signature shut down in perfect sequence. Around them, the weapons platforms did the same, vanishing into the background radiation of the void scar. On the Sovereign Wrath, Silas knew, every sensor would suddenly be screaming that their targets had disappeared. Quick pause. If this story has you hooked, subscribe now and hit the bell. These are made for people like you. Now back to it. The Velthari ship hung motionless in space for 4 minutes. Then its weapons ports opened, and lance beams cut through the void where the Resolute had been, where the platforms had been. The beams found nothing but empty space and the natural radiation interference that made the void scar navigable only by the desperate or the suicidal. Silas watched from the Resolute's darkened bridge as the Sovereign Wrath scans swept across their position 3 times. The ship was less than 2 kilometers away, close enough that he could see the individual heat signatures of its reactor cores through the stealth shroud humanity had developed when hiding became more important than fighting. Velxira's voice crackled through passive receivers. Primitive deception. We know you're here. Reveal yourselves or we will glass every orbital structure in this system. Silas made a small gesture. Faye Cross nodded and triggered a single communications laser, tight beam, undetectable except to its target. You're thinking like someone who has resources to waste, Silas said into the darkness. We don't. Every shot you fire depletes your reserves. Every second you stay in the void scar, your quantum drive destabilizes a little more. You felt it when you came through the barrier. This region of space doesn't play by Covenant physics. The Sovereign Wrath's weapons swiveled, trying to trace the laser's origin. They were 3 degrees off. The Velthari had built their technology for civilized space, where physics cooperated. Your tricks won't, Velxira began. Not tricks, adaptation. You ever wonder why the Covenant chose this particular dead zone for our exile? Silas kept his voice level, conversational. It wasn't mercy. It was because nothing survives here. The dimensional instabilities alone should have torn apart any colony within a generation. But we learned to read them, to predict them, to use them. Dimensional manipulation without quantum cores is impossible. Impossible for species that never had to learn. Silas nodded to Faye Cross again. The space around the Sovereign Wrath rippled, not an attack, a demonstration. For 3 seconds, the dimensional instabilities that occurred naturally in the void scar were focused, amplified, and released in a pattern that made the Velthari ship's shields fluctuate wildly. No damage, just a glimpse of what humanity had learned to weaponize. When the ripple faded, Velxira's voice had lost its musical confidence. How? The mathematical complexity alone would require computational power beyond what primitives should possess? Silas allowed himself a cold smile in the darkness. High Commander, when you're exiled to hell, you either learn to make deals with it or you die. We chose option 1. Silence. 8 seconds this time. The Velthari threat assessment pattern for an unwinnable situation. What do you want? Velxira finally asked. For 300 years, we've wanted to be left alone. That hasn't changed. Go back through the barrier. Tell the Covenant that humanity is extinct or thriving or whatever story keeps them from sending more ships. We don't care. Just stay out. The Covenant doesn't negotiate with exiles. Yes, we know. But here's the situation, High Commander. Your ship is powerful. It's also alone, deep in hostile space, with a quantum drive that's losing coherence every minute you remain here. You can try to fight us, and maybe you win, maybe you don't. But either way, your ship will never make it back through the dimensional barrier. The void scar will tear you apart long before you reach it. Silas leaned back in his command chair, though Velxira couldn't see the gesture. Or you can leave now, while your drive still has enough stability to punch back through. Your choice. But you've got about 8 minutes to make it. You're lying about the drive degradation. Am I? Silas gestured, and Faye Cross transmitted a data packet. Tight beam, encrypted in old Covenant military code that humanity had cracked decades ago. That's your own drive's telemetry. We've been reading it since you came through. Check your engineering section if you don't believe us. Your quantum coherence is at 73% and dropping. By Velthari safety standards, you should be retreating at 75. The silence stretched longer this time. 32 seconds. Silas had never seen a documented Velthari uncertainty pattern that long. It meant Velxira was communicating with her crew, confirming what couldn't possibly be true. When she spoke again, her voice had changed, less musical, more like someone who just realized they were outmatched in ways they didn't understand. If we retreat, the Covenant will send a fleet. Maybe, maybe not. Depends on your report. Silas kept his voice neutral. You could tell them you found nothing, a false alarm, sensor ghosts in a dead zone. Or you could tell them the truth, that humanity survived, adapted, and turned their death sentence into something the Covenant doesn't have protocols for. Your call, High Commander, but make it fast. You're down to 71% coherence. The Sovereign Wrath's weapons ports closed. Its engines began cycling up for dimensional transit. Silas felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. Not much. Not yet. This isn't over, Commander Holt, Velxira said, and the fact that she'd used his name, something Velthari rarely did for species they considered inferior, told him everything about how thoroughly the situation had shifted. The Covenant will return, with understanding of your capabilities. Then they'll learn what we learned. That understanding doesn't mean victory. It just means knowing exactly how badly you'll lose. Silas gestured for the channel to close, then stopped. High Commander, one more thing. Yes? The dimensional barrier you used to seal us in? We could break through it any time we wanted. We choose not to. Remember that when you're writing your report. The transmission ended. The Sovereign Wrath's form began to shimmer as its quantum drive fought against the Void Scar's natural instabilities. For a moment, Silas thought the ship might not make it, that the degradation had gone too far. Then the dimensional barrier tore open, and the Velthari dreadnought vanished back into normal space. Silas let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Stand down from Hollow Crown, bring all systems back online, and get me a damage assessment on... Commander, Faycross's voice was tight. We've got another breach. Marker 33 Delta. Multiple signatures. Covenant fleet configuration. The view screen lit up with new contacts. Not one dreadnought. 7. And these weren't exploratory vessels. These were warships. Heavy battle cruisers with weapon signatures that read like nothing in humanity's database. Silas felt ice settle in his gut. They were waiting. Velxira was the scout. Sir, we can't fight that many ships. Even with the platforms, the antimatter reserves won't be enough, I know. Silas's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. The dimensional weapon we showed Velxira, what's our charge time on the full-scale version? Faycross checked her readouts. 11 minutes. But Commander, we've never tested it at that scale. The mathematical models suggest that it could collapse dimensional stability across the entire system. I know. Do it anyway, and get me a channel to the lead ship. The hologram flickered. This time the commander wasn't Velthari. It was Thraxian, massive, crimson-scaled, with 3 eyes that humans had learned could see into infrared and ultraviolet simultaneously. General Dravath, according to the translation matrix. One of the Covenant's strategic commanders, reserved for threats that required extinction-level response. Commander Holt, Dravath's voice rumbled like tectonic plates grinding. You have demonstrated technological advancement that violates Covenant quarantine protocols. Under Galactic Law, Section 779, subsection, skip the legal justification, General. We both know you're here to finish what the Exile started. Silas kept his voice level. Question is whether you're willing to pay the price. All 3 of Dravath's eyes focused on him with predatory intensity. Your weapons platforms are impressive for primitive technology. Insufficient against 7 battle cruisers. Your dimensional manipulation tricks may destabilize 1 ship, not 7. You will surrender, or we will demonstrate why the Thraxian Empire enforces Covenant law. 9 minutes, Faycross whispered from her station. Silas made a decision that part of him knew he'd regret if they survived. General, you're right. We can't fight 7 ships, but we can do something else. He gestured. The main view screen shifted, showing not the Covenant fleet, but the vast network of stations, platforms, and colonies that humanity had built in 3 centuries of exile. Millions of lives, the entire surviving human species, concentrated in a single system because they had nowhere else to go. See all of that? Every orbital habitat, every mining station, every ship. Silas's voice went cold. We've rigged all of it with the same dimensional technology you're so concerned about. One signal from this ship, and we collapse dimensional stability across the entire system. No survivors. Not us, not you. Just a permanent scar in space-time that'll make the Void Scar look like a minor inconvenience. Dravath's central eye narrowed. You're bluffing. No species would commit suicide rather than submit to extinction. General, you exiled us to die. We've been living with that death sentence for 300 years. You think we haven't prepared for the day you came back to finish the job? Silas leaned forward. We're not bluffing. We're offering you a choice. Leave now or share our grave. 6 minutes, Faycross said, quieter this time. The Thraxian general was silent for what felt like an eternity. Behind him, Silas could see movement on the battlecruiser's bridge, officers conferring, scanning for confirmation of the threat. They'd find it. Humanity had made sure the signatures would read exactly right. What they wouldn't find was that the charges were time-delayed, set to detonate only if the Covenant fleet opened fire first. It wasn't a suicide weapon. It was a deterrent based on the enemy's belief that humans were crazy enough to use it. Silas hoped they were convincing enough. "Your species," Dravath finally said, "is insane. Our species is cornered. There's a difference." Silas kept his hands steady on the armrest, knowing the Thraxian could probably read minute physiological changes through the hologram. "Make your choice, General. 4 minutes and counting." Another eternal pause. Then Dravath's three eyes shifted in a pattern that humanity's xenology experts had identified as grudging respect mixed with pure, honest fear. "We will withdraw. But understand, Commander, this precedent cannot stand. The Covenant will deliberate. They will find a solution to the threat you represent. Let them deliberate. We've gotten good at waiting." Silas nodded. "General, one last thing since we're being honest. That dimensional collapse weapon, it's real. The part about rigging everything to blow on command? 30% bluff, 70% truth. You'd have had maybe a 40% chance of surviving if you'd called it." He saw the calculations running behind Dravath's eyes. 40%. In military terms, unacceptable odds for a mission that was supposed to be a simple cleanup operation. "Your species," the Thraxian general repeated, "is absolutely insane." The transmission ended. The Covenant fleet held position for 90 seconds, just long enough to run final confirmation scans, then turned in perfect formation and punched back through the dimensional barrier. Silas waited until the barrier sealed before he let himself slump back in his chair. "Stand down, dimensional weapon, and somebody get me a full casualty report on—" "Sir," Faycross interrupted, "there are no casualties. They never fired." "I know. I mean from the charge up. That much dimensional manipulation, even incomplete, should have caused some instability in—" "No, sir. I mean, we never actually initiated the dimensional weapon. The charge timer you saw was a simulation I ran to keep the bluff consistent." Silas stared at her. "You, what?" Faycross met his eyes with the same steady calm she'd maintained throughout the engagement. "Sir, you taught us that in war, the enemy's beliefs are more powerful than their weapons. The Thraxians believed we'd armed the weapon because they saw what they expected to see. I just gave them better data to confirm that belief." For a moment, Silas didn't know whether to be furious or impressed. Then he started laughing, a tired, genuine sound that he hadn't made in months. "Lieutenant Cross, you just ran a complete tactical deception over my head during a first contact engagement with a Covenant enforcement fleet." "Yes, sir. In my defense, you were busy with the actual bluff." "Fair point." Silas stood, his legs unsteady with the after effects of adrenaline crash. "All stations, return to standard patrol rotation, and somebody wake up the council. They're going to want to hear about this." As the bridge crew began the systematic process of standing down from battle stations, Silas looked out at the void where two separate Covenant forces had retreated in the span of an hour. 300 years ago, they'd exiled humanity to die in the dark. They'd assumed that isolation would either kill the species or break it. They'd never considered a third option. That in the darkness, humanity would learn to see things the Covenant couldn't. That exile would forge something the Galactic Covenant had no framework to understand. Not primitives surviving against the odds, not rebels waiting for rescue, but a species that had looked at their death sentence and built something new from it. Something that didn't need the Covenant's approval, or their laws, or their galaxy. Silas thought about Velxira's final words. The Covenant will return. Probably true. They'd come back eventually, with better preparation, better understanding, better tactics. And humanity would adapt again. They'd learned that lesson thoroughly. You couldn't kill what had already learned to die. Behind him, Faycross was already running simulations for the next engagement, her fingers moving across tactical displays with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd grown up knowing that tomorrow's survival depended on today's preparation. Around the bridge, the crew worked with the same quiet intensity. No celebration, no relief. Just the steady rhythm of people who knew the difference between winning a battle and surviving a war. Silas returned to his command chair and pulled up the long-range sensors. Out there, past the dimensional barrier, the Galactic Covenant controlled thousands of systems, millions of ships, resources that humanity couldn't match in 1,000 years of building. But the Covenant had one critical weakness. They'd forgotten what it meant to fight with nothing left to lose. They'd grown comfortable in their superiority, their laws, their absolute certainty that the galaxy belonged to them. Humanity had learned a different lesson in 3 centuries of exile. That home wasn't a place the Covenant could grant or deny. It was what you built when nowhere else would have you. It was every jury-rigged station, every desperate innovation, every time someone looked at impossible odds and found a way anyway. The void scar stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, hostile and beautiful and utterly indifferent to whether anyone survived it. Humanity had made peace with that indifference, had learned to thrive in it. Let the Covenant come back if they wanted. Humanity would be waiting, not with armies or fleets, but with 300 years of hard-won knowledge that the galaxy's outcasts had become something the galaxy itself couldn't comprehend. In the darkness, humanity had learned to burn with a light all their own.